that assuming that the technology which can predict crime to a very high probability exists, this House would use it to preemptively arrest individuals for their potential involvement. I'd now like to welcome Hong Yu to begin the case and stand in his name.
The status quo justice is inadequate. It is inadequate because even though we are able to arrest people and put them in prison for crimes, we can't restore the lives that were lost. We can't restore the innocence, the lives, and the psychological well-being of people who were raped and violated. We can't restore to individuals the property that was stolen from them, destroyed. We can't restore lives of individuals, peace of mind that they get from not having suffered a crime before. We think that if we have technology that enables us to protect people from these crimes, to prevent these crimes from occurring in the first place, we're perfectly justified going forward and using this technology to ensure that these people don't suffer these things in the first place, to ensure that people who with a very high probability will commit these crimes don't ever commit these crimes. What am I talking about? First of all, under our model, we are assuming that some form of technology that enables us to predict to a very high degree of probability that a certain individual will commit a certain crime at a certain day and a certain time. We think if that's the case, the police officers can use that certain evidence and present it before a court of law to get a warrant, right, to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt, to ensure that the evidence is truly something that can be believed. And when they do so, the court can then issue a warrant to arrest this particular individual and to detain him until the moment in which the crime is about to be committed. Because we're assuming that the technology is good enough for us to predict when the crime will be committed. We think we detain him until that particular moment. Then after that, if there's no probability that he will commit the crime again, then we don't detain him and we let him go. If the probability, for example, is indefinite, we then think that it's very hard for the prosecution to prove their case because they can't even know when the crime was committed in the first place, right? Even if the extreme scenario in which it's possible this person will commit it and we don't know the crime where the crime will occur, we think we're okay with defending indefinite detention in these extremely rare instances because we think the importance of protecting society is so important. Two things I'm going to talk about today. First of all, principles of criminal justice and why we think this fits within this particular model. Second, how do we balance the rights of individuals against the rights of the rest of society? Before that,
do you concede to some extent that there might be a technological slip-up?
Okay, I'm actually going to deal with this in a second substantive, but let me just deal with it now, right? Because we're only talking about high probability, not talking about certainties. We think that in fact, when we talk about status quo, we can never be certain. The prosecution can only prove things beyond a reasonable doubt. We can never be sure that the person has actually committed the crime because we don't have the technology to do so, to survey everything. If we did, we'd be happy to support it as well. But we don't. So we think we're talking about things like high probability. It's the same thing as having status quo. We're going to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person who had committed a particular crime. So we don't think there's a distinction there. The principles of criminal justice, right? Core argument here, the society has an interest in protecting itself and individuals from the consequences of crime, which cannot be erased. And because in status quo justice is only reactive, you can only react to the occurrence of crimes that actually occur, and then by the time the damage has actually done, and it's too late. And we punish individuals on the basis that they then owe responsibility to society, or they should be punished in the form of responsiveness to these particular actions. But nothing that we do can actually take away the fact that the crime is committed in the first place. We may attempt to tip the cosmic scales of justice, or we don't erase or mitigate the harms that actually occur. Right? More than that, we see that in status quo, in fact, the goal of deterrence preventing crime is a very important element in criminal justice. That's why we have things like, for example, the laws against criminal conspiracy, which arrest people for plotting together and planning to commit a crime. In those instances, no crime has actually been committed, but we prevent people from doing so and we stop them from doing so because we want to ensure they don't actually carry out their plots to destroy people and to take away their lives. More than that, we think that when we talk about rule of law and we talk about the rule of justice, it is about protecting the interests of the individuals, ensuring that they don't suffer, innocent people don't suffer with the consequences of the choices of criminals to engage in this particular activity, right? You see, again, for example, we arrest people for drunk and disorderly behavior on the basis that them being drunk and disorderly makes them more likely to commit crimes in the future, and we protect people from the consequences of these crimes. Second, we think that the state has a moral obligation to protect society, right, when there's information that a crime is about to be committed, in order to ensure, because of its duty to the population as the basis of protector of its security, the basis of protection of the life of these particular individuals. The reason why the state is formed in the first place is so that individuals can come together to ensure they're protected from the choices of other individuals. Right? That's the only real legitimate basis on which the state can function, right, which is the protection of third-party harm, something UT should be very familiar with. Right? But we think that ultimately when we talk about the role of the state, right, the mandate of the state, it is precisely to protect individuals from third-party harm, to ensure that individuals interact with others in the free society and community don't suffer the consequences of others. Second argument, right? Why in fact we think we best protect the individual and we best protect the state. And of course, there on the other side, I don't think I'm going to argue that we shouldn't arrest people at all, right? So the distinction that we need to draw is why we think reactive confiscation of somebody's rights, in terms of confiscating their rights and sending them to jail in reaction to somebody's rights, is more justified than preemptive confiscation. Because we think that roughly they're the same thing if you can predict they're about to commit a crime. Because we think on the first level that rights are forwarded and founded on the basis of the society's ability to guarantee and protect these particular rights, right? It's founded on the basis that the rights are not something that's absolute, but something that's based on a relationship with others, right? They're based on relationship with community, based on relationship with others. And we can always mitigate, we can always restrict these rights on the basis of protecting others, on the basis that the way you're interacting with other society is something that's wrong and something you want to guard against. We don't think there's a real clear distinction that we can draw here about preemptive confiscation of their right and reactive confiscation. But in both instances, we're talking about mitigating the consequences of their choices and restricting their rights on this basis. Second, we think that the state should mitigate the consequences of choices that affect others who don't consent to this particular form of harm. Right? Because we're talking about crimes here, we're talking about innocent victims and individuals who don't consent to having had their actions being perpetrated upon them. Right? And the state has the responsibility to mitigate the consequences of those actions. Third, we think that this in fact better enhances our right obligations to the individual in question who is being arrested. Because if we're talking about individuals who probably don't think they're going to commit a crime, so the crime maybe is a rash act, something they will later regret and so forth, we think we in fact better help this individual because we prevent him from doing something that he will regret later on. We help him to realize that he can carry out a certain harm, or may have a certain thinking that would have led him to commit a crime in the future, and we prevent him from doing that in the first place, which we think is good for him. Because we think that for this individual, the commission of a crime itself is also a harm to him because of the psychological damage that he then receives, and because of the realization he's taken away something that is dear to him. Right? On the second level, we're talking about individuals who are already sort of planning to commit a crime, who had it in their minds. We then think it's perfectly justified for us to arrest them before they do anything that actually commits themselves to a life of crime, and to ensure we are properly able to rehabilitate him, to ensure that he steps out of it as fast as possible before he actually does something which might condemn him even further. Right? So on these two levels, because one, we think that when we talk about crime, we're able to prevent it from occurring and ensuring that people don't suffer the consequences of those crimes. We should go out there to ensure that those things don't happen, because we best uphold the rights of the state, as an individual, and we also best help the individual in question. We're very, very proud to propose this motion.
I'd like to thank Hong Yu for that speech. To open the case for side opposition, Ariel.
Mr. Speaker, side opposition takes the deontological position that the means is as important as the ends. And we think that preemptively arresting individuals is wrong, is morally vacuous, and is something which is abhorrent that civil society should reject. So we believe that instead under status quo we have reactive measures to punish people who committed crimes and who transgress the law. We also have preventive measures such as moral education, religion, for example, and also the fear of the law in itself to prevent people from committing crime. However, the physical and tangible action of detaining a person before he commits a crime transgress these ideas because you're prejudicing the individual before he even committed anything at all. The first point of rebuttal is with regards to the practicalities. We don't think that future is predetermined. Most of the time, it won't happen despite the fact that you're able to predict it to happen. So your technology might be wrong, so there might be flaws, and you might even detain someone who never had the capability or never would have done it in the first place. But on the second level is the analysis of the principal argument on what is exactly the moral duty of the state. We think, Mr. Speaker, with regards to
on that point,
sit down, is of course the moral obligation of the state to protect society, right? But we never had any analysis on how the rights of that individual who might commit a crime should be safeguarded for the state as well. Because here's our response. We think that the means is as important as the end. And if your means is predicated on arresting someone who has never committed a crime as well, if the means are corrupted, the ends are corrupted as well. Someone who is innocent and isn't guilty at all will be prejudiced because of the fact that he didn't commit a crime in the first place. So essentially the type of end that you're creating is not one where society is safe now, but where society is living in fear under the tyranny of a certain machine which is able to detect or predict whether they're able to commit a crime. The third idea is how it enhances that individual's rights, because he might commit or he might regret committing that crime. But the question is this: how do you rehabilitate an individual who didn't commit the crime in the first place? Because you're always wondering, what did I do? What did I commit for me to deserve this type of imprisonment and to deserve this type of rehabilitation that you're forcing down my throat? We think that any form of rehabilitation will be counterproductive, considering the individual is only angry and is dissatisfied with regards to the role of the state. Now, we think that the idea of applying for a court warrant is very false, because most of the time courts operate on actus reus and mens rea. There has to be a physical act as well. So we don't think that whatever courts that you're proposing won't really give that warrant. We think that like laws such as criminal conspiracy has some elements of a physical act as well. They have to have preparation. You can't just have the intention to do so and the permission to do so. You have to have some element of preparation to do so, which involves a physical act. And most of the time, it's a lighter sentence as compared to doing that act as well. So we think, whatever analogy that you're giving is good and hasn't been accepted by society, except for societies which have preventive detention, such as the Singaporean ISA. Malaysia doesn't have that anymore. First, we're going to talk about how side government is distorting the principles of justice, how you're prejudicing the individual who hasn't committed the crime. Secondly, we're going to talk about the consequences of the act, not only about the fairness and principles, and what type of society are you re-engineering with this proposal.
Beyond, why is physical action so sacrosanct? That is the only reason why we can prevent people from committing a crime.
Because it's tangible. Because it's effective. Because people feel the pain as compared to intention or some premonition, which is something abstract and cannot be captured in a realistic conception of world. So first idea is the principles of justice, right? Now, we think that the problem if you incapacitate someone who hasn't committed a crime is that he'll lose his livelihood, he'll be stigmatized by society, and he will have to do something which he hasn't committed in the first place. The second analysis is that most of the time people might do something out of bad intention. You might want to kill a guy, and you might have a certain disposition to commit a crime. We think that bad intentions or disposition or a certain disposition to create a crime does not attribute towards the crime itself, and does not warrant any form of retribution, because essentially what that person did was that he never committed the crime as well. No third party was harmed. And according to principles such as the harm principle, what's essential is you harming a third person. So intention or any form of probability of you committing a crime has never harmed an individual in the first place. So why are you locking that person up behind bars? We think that act is more important than intent or probability, and under status quo we have criminalized people because of their actions and not because of their intentions, such as criminal negligence. You might be negligent, you didn't have any intention to hurt that guy, but the fact of the matter is the guy was hurt. So you gotta do something, and that's why retribution happens under status quo. Secondly is the idea of proportionality, because society has always been underpinned by elements such as justice and fairness. Yeah, the guy might kill the guy, but you don't give him a death penalty in most postmodernist states such as UK, Sweden, etc. Because of the fact that you recognize that it's better to be the bigger man and realize and be on a higher standard as compared to the person who is a criminal or presumed to be a criminal. We think that's what society should be. The bigger person or the person who has a higher standard of morality as compared to government. Thirdly is the idea of closure, because the time closure, and one of the core principles of justice has always been closure, and closure to the victim. Under status quo, before a person committed a crime, the type of closure that you're giving to a person is a gratification to a probable victim, is a gratification that he might have committed the crime, but he never committed the crime at all. So any type of closure that you're going to give is good, as ineffective, and will only prejudice the individual. Secondly is the idea of consequences, because we think that society, which is the society that you're re-engineering is one which is premised on fear and will generate a climate of fear. Because the problem is, if a person hasn't been, if a person is caught because not of some act, but because of some transient or some ephemeral or ethereal conception of your model, then anybody has the propensity to be caught. Anybody can be caught. And it can happen anytime, as long as you go through that process of having a court warrant. We think, Mr. Speaker, the type of society that we create is one which is predicated on fear and generated on the idea of who will be caught next, and insecurity because the government is capable of looking and catching you whenever he wants, wherever he wants. We think that's harmful because the individual should be free from fear, knowing that he has done something. Only would then he be punished by laws and remedied because of that. But because of thinking and not doing anything, we don't think so, Mr. Speaker. We're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Ari for that speech. To continue the case for side proposition, I'd now like to recognize Imran.
See, when I was 15, I had a friend from another school. Wasn't a good friend, as in he was just a friend. His father was a rich businessman, owned a nice Mercedes Benz. Very, very well to do. But his father was the only sole breadwinner. One day in August 18th, this made all the news the next day. Someone jumped into his father's car, demanded money. His father refused it. The guy stabbed him 47 times, grabbed his body, put it into the boot of the car, and left him there to rot. True, as a result, what happened was he was fatherless for the rest of his life. I can never imagine what it means to be without a father for my entire life, especially when I lost him at the age of 15. If all it calls for is the temporary detention of these individuals to that point where he's committing that crime, why is it so bad? We understand that it is a fetter upon your rights, that we are limiting things that you would otherwise have done. But at what cost? We get to keep a family intact. We ensure that they get a father to go back home after every single day of school, and we think that is the best compromise we can achieve in this house. I'm going to have one argument later in my point of substantive about how the state becomes complicit in these crimes and subsequently becomes unfair when the individual who commits the crime is punished for it. But before that, a few rebuttals. Firstly, let's deal with the principles of justice that Ari talked about. He talked about ideas like proportionality, he talked about ideas like catharsis and closure, and everything else you'll find when you're talking about principles of justice. The reason why this is important is because of the nature of the law as it stands right now, where the law is at best reactive. And when the law is reactive, arguments like proportionality, arguments like catharsis and closure become fundamentally important. But if we are able to step in before that crime is committed, arguments about proportionality and closure cease to be important anymore. Because right now what we are effectively doing is ensuring that crime isn't even committed in the first place, that we don't have to emotionally compensate anybody else. And that is the nuance they didn't quite get. Then you try to spin this rhetoric, but then you live in a society of fear. Firstly, no, we're not Stalinist Russia. We're not randomly picking people off the streets to put them into jail. There is a reasonable and understandable nexus involved here, right? That you are about to commit a crime and that the court of law has justified it beyond a reasonable doubt and subsequently issued a subpoena. People will understand it, will publicize it all over the place. Secondly, which is more fearful? To know that any time of the day when you walk down a dark alleyway, the possibility of getting robbed, raped, mugged or killed, or the idea that when you walk down the street, it is safe. That when you walk down the street, then nobody will harm you. In other words, Singapore. That's the thing I'm trying to achieve. Yes, let's go to the principles. Then you went out there, but you can't predict. Obviously, for this debate to occur, the technology must be good enough for us to base it on, right? And true, there might be technological slips. That's the beauty of arguments, and that's the beauty of our policy. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That the court has to judge it on the basis of the evidence that you do provide. We think that's reasonable enough. Now, principles. He went up there and he tried to argue, look, when you're talking about crimes of criminal conspiracy, you have physical evidence you can present to the court, and on that basis you decide whether or not he's going to be making a particular crime. We agree. But we're obviously talking about developments when it comes to criminal sites. We're talking about the ability to determine and get other forms of information, even maybe to portray or reenact the information in very 3D form. And what we're basically doing is the same principle, right? At the end of the day, you're preventing a crime from being committed. You recognize that even the attempt or the ability to plan that crime is a criminal act in and of itself. And that's the argument that underscores the crimes of criminal conspiracy that we think comes into the picture as well. We think it's just the manner of proving it is different. Instead of using the physical evidence that was actually used by these individuals, we're using the evidence that we can glean from such things. Not only that, we think that the prevention of crime has always been a sacrosanct principle enshrined by the law, right? Take some example, deterrence. The only reason why deterrence even makes sense is because we want to prevent other people from committing the crime, right? Because we fetishize and we prioritize the ability to prevent crimes from happening. If you are able to actually achieve that, we think we're playing up to the values of the law. Not only that, They didn't respond to the nuances coming out from Hong Lee. Firstly, the moral obligation that if you were in possession of information that is important, that will lead to the safety and security of individuals, there is a moral obligation incumbent upon the state to act upon it. I look forward to the response coming from Shafiq. Next, the argument about free choice. We allow individuals to make free choices and also subsequently the ability to make wrong choices. If you are able to guard individuals who don't consent to the consequences of their wrong choice, why don't we do it? Third argument, the relational nature of rights. The idea that rights are never absolute. That it's always predicated on your relationship vis-a-vis the rest of the community. That we recognize it is not like completely absolute and that we can fend it from time to time. But more importantly, why is it fair? Because in the law, on the law books right now, what do we have? We detain individuals for drunk and disorderly behavior because we recognize the possibility that that individual in that state of mind might commit a crime. We allow for the temporary detention of the individual until he regains his capabilities and his understanding that he should not commit that crime again, right? When he's sober, basically. And it's just an extension of the principle right now. Because you weigh it up, right? Your ability to be detained for a short period of time vis-a-vis the right of these people to a father, a mother, to a sole breadwinner who can basically keep the family secure. You disagree?
Like, most of the time, preventive or deterrence measures are psychological in nature. It exists in the mind and is never tangible because you recognize that that person is innocent until he commits a crime. So,
no, but that misses the entire debate. We understand, right? It's psychological and everything else. Now, your argument right now here is that, look, this person won't understand why he's being detained. Then we'll tell him why he's being detained. We'll give him the evidence that basically convince the court of law why exactly it was proved beyond reasonable doubt. And if you are a normal human being and you realize that you are going to be probably committing a murder, in most instances, you will quietly go to the detention center to prevent yourself from committing a crime. If you're the other kind, then we want yourself to be detained temporarily because we don't want you killing people. And that's the point, right? Because we think the commission of a crime is a heinous act that creates massive psychological damage to an individual. If we are able to stop him from committing murder to another individual, we think that that's good to that individual, something they need to respond to. Why does the state become complicit? Because right now, right, the state will be guilty of a crime of omission. It knows that a crime is occurring, it knows when exactly it's going to occur, but it refuses to do anything about it and lets the crime occur. But what's most pernicious about this particular phenomena? When you do catch that individual, when you do send him to jail, what you do is that the full retributive effect of the law falls upon the one singular individual and not upon the state, by the virtue of the fact that they are the state, that they are the monolithic Leviathan. And we think that's massively unfair, because they're shielding themselves in the liability that we think we should act upon. We think they're shielding themselves in the kind of social and moral obligation that they should basically carry out and that they owe to the rest of society. What we want to do right now is that we want to hold the state liable and morally accountable to these kind of crimes that are going to commit, especially when you're talking about an alternative reality where they're in possession of this kind of information that is fundamental to stopping this kind of crimes. We don't want to allow the state, even after understanding that these crimes will be occurring in the near future, to allow the full weight of the law to be foisted upon that one singular individual, we think especially pernicious. And for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we're extremely proud to propose.
Run for that speech. So KIDA case, the side opposition.
yeah.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I have a friend too. At 15, his father was caught for allegedly killing a person. And the father stayed in prison for over 50 years for it. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, the father wasn't guilty and the father had to go to prison, depriving that family from a father. So we think, we on the side of opposition are willing to see 10 guilty people go free than see one innocent person go to prison. Because under the principle of justice, and this is an extension to what Eri has talked about and a rebuttal to what Imran said, is that the state's moral obligation is not only to the society at large, it's also to the individuals that were involved in the crime. What their model does is they're having a trial pre-crime, i.e. before the crime is committed. You have to understand, under the principle of justice, is that the circumstances in which the crime was committed is important for the criminal to defend himself, ladies and gentlemen. I.e., if he murdered someone out of necessity or out of mistake, ladies and gentlemen, he should be given that chance to defend himself in court based on the circumstances of that crime. What they're doing is that they are prematurely assuming that that person did the crime with malice, ladies and gentlemen, and there's no defense or good intentions whatsoever behind this person. That is why it's problematic, ladies and gentlemen, and we stand for the right of these individuals. Secondly, they wanted to argue on the idea of deterrence. They argued that this policy will prevent people from committing this crime. That presumes that there's no counter technology for people to hide from this technology. But on the second level, we have to analyze the psyche of a criminal. The psyche of a criminal is that when he does something, he assumes that he won't get caught, ladies and gentlemen. He assumes that that technology will slip, ladies and gentlemen. So he won't necessarily deter people from committing this crime. Moreover, deterrents only operate if the enforcement is strong, i.e. if you can track down every single individual that is that is going to commit a crime. Therefore, you won't get everybody, and deterrence doesn't stand on that side of the house. Right? Let's look at this idea on Singapore, because I have to make fun of it. They propose something, ladies and gentlemen, that is like Singapore. If you don't like where you stay, Imran, don't impose what you have on other people. To recognize in this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about rehabilitation, and what they're doing is a psychological torture onto certain individuals. Let's look at this case. They want to catch a person and tell that person that you are about to commit a crime. That's why we are catching you. In prison, ladies and gentlemen, that person that thought that he is a good person, a good Muslim, ladies and gentlemen, knows that he is capable of killing someone. What you do is that you are unleashing an evil part in him, and you are making him realize that he will do something that is wrong. What does that do is that it's either when he's released into society, he will do it, ladies and gentlemen, or you are making him go through a psychological torture, because at the point where the crime was supposed to be committed, he will be going, this is the time where I'm going to murder someone. Just imagine, your whole life, you're thinking that you're a good person, and suddenly someone tells you that you're capable of doing something like that. We think that emotional and psychological trauma that you're putting that person in is unconscionable, and we cannot stand for that. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we think, ladies and gentlemen, listen down, I know I'm a better Muslim than you. It is important. Okay. Don't stand up, ask Hong Yu to stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that it is also important for rehabilitation. Effective rehabilitation comes from a person realizing that he has committed a crime, and he admits wrong for what he has done, ladies and gentlemen. What you're doing is that you're telling this person that you did something which he is in denial of, ladies and gentlemen, that he knows that he wouldn't have committed, because they are disregarding the human and spiritual element that a person may change or may not contribute to the crime that you assume a person is going to do. What does that do is that a person will not be fully rehabilitated. The reverse effect will occur, i.e. the person will feel like the government put me in prison for a crime that I will never ever commit. This will lead to that person wanting to retaliate, ladies and gentlemen, to the government, and to confirm that I am capable of doing this, and I will do what you have put me in prison for, ladies and gentlemen. And that is problematic, and we won't stand for that. I told you, tell Hong Yi to stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, second point that I want to make is that it will lead to prison overcrowding. And this is important, because prison overcrowding leads to flagrant violations of human rights. Because if you're going to preemptively catch people and put in prison, before that, Hong Yi.
Which is worse for a good Muslim? Preventing him from committing a murder, or him actually committing a murder and then suffering because of it.
Okay, what is bad for a good Muslim is alcohol. So drink alcohol. Going back to what I was talking about, how this will lead to prison overcrowding. You have to understand that since they are picking everyone and putting them in prison based on the crime of thought, ladies and gentlemen, and not act, this will lead to a lot of people getting thrown into prison. Everyone here has one day thought about killing someone, but we never did so. You are going to put those people in prison, and it's going to lead to a lot of people in prison. In California, for example, where we put a lot of people in prison, people have to live in solitary confinement. People have to live, share a cell 4 to 5 people when that cell was made for 1 or 2 persons. You are making people mix with high-level criminals. You are making people, live in unsanitary conditions. You're screwing up basically everything that you stand for in terms of human rights, and that is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this conditions, human rights conditions, is also part of justice. Because if you don't take into consideration the plight of that person being in prison, ladies and gentlemen, you are basically being irresponsible and complicit to all the suffering that this person is facing. Lastly, I want to argue to you that it is important that you don't insert this idea that the person is capable of doing something like this. As I mentioned earlier, if I was a good Muslim and I think that I'm moral, and you are telling me that I'm capable of doing something that is as bad as that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that you're going to unleash the evil person in him, and that is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. We have to take into consideration that human element, that the capability of changing and not relying solely on that technology, ladies and gentlemen, has to be taken into consideration. This important notion must absolutely fall because it's no longer important.